The explosion ripped through the diplomatic convoy like a blade through silk, and Princess Sareth Valkyra felt her world shatter in a single heartbeat. She had been sitting in the armored transport, reviewing trade agreements, when the first missile struck the lead vehicle and sent burning metal screaming across the desert road. Her Valorian guards moved instantly, their tall forms surrounding her as plasma fire erupted from the hills on both sides of the convoy. Ambush! One of them screamed, his voice cutting through the chaos. Protect the princess. But the insurgents had planned well, and they had brought enough firepower to kill an Armisrith watched in horror as her guards fell one by one, their bodies yerking as enemy fire found them despite their natural armor and enhanced reflexes. She was going to die here, she realized, on some forgotten road in hostile territory. And no one would ever know what happened to the third daughter of the Valorian Emperor. Then she saw the human commander Marcus. Cole had been assigned to the convoy as part of the Foreign Legion attachment, a group of mercenaries from the lesser species who served the Empire in exchange for credits and citizenship. He was not tall like her people, and he possessed none of their natural advantages. No armored scales beneath his skin, no secondary heart, no regenerative abilities. But when the ambush began, something changed in his eyes. "Your Highness," he shouted, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. "We need to move now." She wanted to protest, to tell him that running was pointless, that they were surrounded and outnumbered and doomed, but he was already pulling her toward a gap in the enemy lines, his weapon firing with precise efficiency. As he moved, the first plasma bolt hit him in the shoulder, and Sareth heard herself scream. Any Valorian would have stumbled, would have needed a moment to let their pain-dampening glands activate and their regeneration begin. Marcus Cole did not stumble. He grunted, shifted his weapon to his other hand, and kept moving. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice strained but steady. "I will get you out of here." "Your Highness." For 17 days, they ran the insurgents, pursued them across the Badlands, and Marcus fought them at every turn, buying time with his blood and his bullets. Sareth learned things about humans during those 17 days that her tutors had never taught her. She learned that they did not regenerate, that every wound they took remained with them until it healed naturally over weeks or months. She learned that they possessed no pain-dampening glands, that they felt every injury with full and terrible intensity. She learned that they needed to sleep, needed to eat, needed to rest in ways that her kind did not. And yet Marcus Cole refused to stop on the third day. A blade found his side, and he packed the wound with field dressing and kept walking on the 7th day. Shrapnel from a grenade embedded itself in his back, and he asked her to pull out the largest pieces before they continued on the 12th day. A plasma burn scorched across his chest, and she smelled his flesh cooking as he returned fire and killed the enemy who had shot him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him one night as they hid in a cave, and she watched him change his bandages with hands that should have been shaking, but were. Node looked at her with those strange human eyes, brown and soft and utterly alien. "Because you are my mission, Your Highness," he said simply. "And I do not fail my missions." She did not understand him then, could not comprehend why any creature would endure such suffering for someone who was not even of their own species. But she was beginning to learn. On the 17th day, they reached the Imperial outpost, and Marcus Cole collapsed at the gates with his hand still wrapped around his weapon. The physicians worked on him for hours, and Sareth refused to leave the medical bay despite the protests of her attendants. She watched them pull metal from his body, watched them seal wounds that should have killed him 3 times over, watched them shake their heads in disbelief at the damage he had absorbed. "How is he still alive?" one of the physicians asked, his voice filled with wonder. "He is human," another replied. As if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. When Marcus finally woke, he found the princess sitting beside his bed, her violet eyes fixed on his face with an expression he could not read. "The doctors say you will recover," she told him. her voice carefully controlled. "They say you should have died many times, but you did not. Humans are stubborn, Your Highness," he said. And something that might have been a smile crossed his face. She did not smile back. "You bled for me," she said. And her voice was different now, heavy with something that sounded almost like anger. "You suffered for me, a stranger, a member of a species that considers your kind inferior, and you asked for nothing in return." Marcus was silent for a moment, uncertain how to respond. "It was my duty," he finally said. "No," she replied, rising to her feet. "It was more than duty, and I will not pretend otherwise." 3 days later, Princess Sareth Valkyra stood before the imperial court and invoked an ancient rite that had not been spoken in 500 years. "Valkythos," she declared, her voice ringing through the great hall. "The blood debt binds this man to House Valkyra from this day until his last breath." The court erupted in outrage. "A human!" Lord Vethral shouted, his scales flushing with fury. "You would bind a human to the royal house with the sacred rite? He has earned it with his blood and his pain and his stubborn human heart," Sareth replied, and her voice was like steel. "Any who dispute this may face me in challenge." No one excepted Marcus Cole watched from his place at the edge of the hall. His wounds still fresh, his body still weak, he did not understand what had just happened. Did not know that the princess had just defied centuries of tradition for a creature the Empire considered barely above an animal, but he saw the way she looked at him as she descended from the dais. Saw the fierce determination in her violet eyes. "You saved my life," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "Now I have given you a place at my side. Whether the galaxy approves or not." "Your Highness," he began. "Sareth," she corrected him. "When we are alone, you will call me Sareth, and you will remember that you are not my servant but my guardian, bound by blood and by choice." Marcus looked at the alien princess who had just turned her court upside down for him, and he felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his healing wounds. "As you wish," he said. "Sareth." And that was how a human mercenary became the shadow of a princess, and how a princess began to see her empire through new eyes. 5 years passed like water flowing between stones. Slow and steady and impossible to stop, Marcus Cole learned to walk the halls of the imperial palace with his head held high, though whispers followed him like hungry ghosts. The human shadow, they called him. The nobles who gathered in perfume clusters to gossip and scheme. The princess's pet. He ignored them because he had learned that their words could not hurt him, not compared to plasma burns and blade wounds and the memory of 17 days in the Wasteland Princess. Sareth had changed in those 5 years, and Marcus had watched the transformation with quiet pride. The frightened girl he had carried through enemy territory had become something stronger, something harder, something that made the court uneasy. In ways they could not quite explain, she asked questions that princesses were not supposed to ask. She visited the lower districts where the lesser species worked and lived and died in service to the Empire. She read human literature, studied human history, learned human languages that no Valorian royal had ever bothered to understand. And always, Marcus was beside her, watching and protecting and offering counsel when she asked for it. "They hate you," she told him one evening, as they walked through the palace gardens under the light of 3 moons. "The nobles, the suitors, my own family, they all despise your presence." "I know," Marcus replied, his eyes scanning the shadows out of habit. "Does that bother you, Sareth?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft. "It used to," she admitted. "I used to care what they thought, used to want their approval and their respect. But you taught me something in those 17 days that I have never forgotten." "What did I teach you?" "That approval means nothing if it must be bought with silence," she said, turning to look at him with those violet eyes that still made his heart beat faster after all these years. You never asked me to change, never expected me to be anything other than what I was. Even when I was frightened and useless and crying in a cave while you bled for me, Marcus felt something warm in his chest. Something he had learned to ignore because feeling it too deeply would only lead to pain. You were never useless, he said quietly. You survived, and survival is the hardest thing there is. She smiled at him then. And it was not the practiced smile she wore for the court, but something real and rare and precious. My brother Cale came to see me today, she said. And the smile faded. He told me that our father is dying. The words hung in the air like smoke. Heavy and dark Emperor Veltharan had ruled the Valorian Empire for 300 years. And his death would change everything. What does this mean for you? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. It means Cale will become emperor, Sareth replied. And there was fear in her voice now. Real fear that she would never show to anyone else. And Cale hates humans. Marcus, he hates them with a passion that frightens me. Prince Cale Valkyra was everything his sister was not. Cruel, where she was kind. Ambitious, where she was thoughtful. Convinced of Valorian superiority in a way that left no room for doubt or growth. He had made his feelings about the human shadow very clear on multiple occasions. I will not leave you, Marcus said. And his voice was steady as stone. Whatever comes, I will not leave. Sareth reached out and took his hand. Her scales cool against his human skin. I know, she whispered. That is what frightens me most. The diplomatic summit on Kethra Station was supposed to be a celebration of imperial unity. A gathering of noble houses to honor the ailing emperor instead. It became a hunting ground. Marcus sensed the danger before he saw it. That prickling awareness that had kept him alive through a dozen wars and 100 battles. Sareth, get down, he shouted, throwing himself toward her as the assassin emerged from the crowd. With a neural injector in hand, the poison was meant for the princess. A toxin designed specifically for Valorian biology that would have killed her in seconds. It struck Marcus instead. Felt it enter his bloodstream like liquid fire. Felt his nervous system begin to collapse as the foreign substance attacked his brain. But human biology was not Valorian biology. And the toxin that would have been instantly fatal to Sareth merely drove Marcus to his knees in agony. Still managed to draw his weapon and put 3 shots into the assassin before he collapsed. The next thing he knew, he was in the medical bay again, and Sareth was sitting beside his bed again. And the universe had gone dark and strange and painful. You should be dead, the physician told him. Disbelief evident in every word. The toxin should have killed any species within seconds. But your human physiology somehow metabolized it before it could reach your vital organs. Humans are hard to kill, Marcus managed to say. His voice rough and weak. Sareth dismissed the physician with a wave of her hand. And then they were alone. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. And there were tears in her violet eyes that Marcus had never seen before. Why do you keep bleeding for me, human? She asked, and her voice was broken in a way that hurt him more than any wound. Marcus thought about the question. Thought about 5 years of watching her grow and change and become something remarkable. Thought about the way his heart raced when she smiled, and the way his soul settled when she was near. Because someone has to, he said finally. And I decided it would be me. But why? She pressed, leaning closer. You owe me nothing. Marcus, the blood debt binds you to my house, not to my heart. And you could have found 100 ways to fulfill your obligation without suffering like this. He reached up with a trembling hand and touched her face. An intimacy that would have been unthinkable when they first met. Because I see you, he said softly. Not the princess, not the royal, not the political piece to be moved around the board. I see you, Sareth. The woman who holds her heart like a shield and her kindness like a secret. And I would bleed for you 1,000 times rather than watch that light go out. She was crying now, tears running down her scaled cheeks. And she took his hand and held it against her face. "My father will die soon," she whispered. "And when he does, my brother will come for you. And I do not know if I can protect you from him. Then we will face him together," Marcus replied. "As we have faced everything else." She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, a gesture of intimacy among her people that he had never expected to receive. "I am afraid," she admitted. "So am I," he said. "But fear has never stopped me before. And it will not stop me now." Outside the medical bay, the galaxy continued to turn, and Emperor Veltharan drew closer to death with each passing hour. And Prince Kale made his plans in shadow and silence, but in that small room, a human and a princess held each other and found courage in connection. And neither of them knew that the hardest days were still to come. Emperor Veltharan died on a cold morning when the stars themselves seemed to dim with. Griefshirth stood at his bedside with her siblings, watching the light fade from his ancient eyes. And she felt something inside her shatter that would never fully heal. Her father had not been a kind man, had not been the gentle presence that human children seem to expect from their parents. But he had been steady and strong and eternal in a way that made his death feel like the ending of an age. And then Kale smiled. And Sareth knew that the true darkness was only beginning. Her brother moved quickly, securing alliances and making promises and eliminating rivals with the efficiency of a predator who had been waiting his entire life for this moment within a week. He sat upon the imperial throne, and within a month, he began to show the galaxy what kind of emperor he would be. Purges started quietly at first. A noble house here, a military commander there, anyone who might pose a threat to his absolute rule. But soon the pattern became clear, and the lesser species began to suffer. Most of all, new laws restricted where they could live and work. New taxes stripped away the little wealth they had managed to accumulate. New regulations made it clear that the empire belonged to Valorians and no one else. Marcus watched it all with growing dread, knowing that his turn would come. It came on a night when Sareth was away, summoned to a distant province on a fabricated emergency that left him alone and unprotected. The Imperial Guard came for him at midnight, and they did not come gently. "Commander Marcus Cole," the captain announced, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "By order of Emperor Kale Valkyra, you are under arrest for undue influence over a member of the royal family." Marcus could have fought. Part of him wanted to fight, wanted to take as many of them with him as possible before they brought him down. But fighting would give Kale the excuse he needed to move against Sareth. And Marcus would not put her at risk for the sake of his pride. "I will come peacefully," he said, setting down his weapon. "But know that the princess will not let this stand." The captain laughed, a cold and ugly sound. "The princess is no longer relevant," he replied. "And you, human, are about to learn your place." They dragged him to the detention levels beneath the palace, to cells that had been built for enemies of the empire and traitors to the throne. The interrogators came the next day, and they were very interested in making Marcus confess. "Tell us about your relationship with Princess Sareth," they demanded. "Tell us how you manipulated her, how you used your human tricks to poison her mind against her own kind." Marcus said nothing. They heard him, using techniques that would have broken most creatures within hours. But Marcus had spent his entire life learning to endure pain. He thought of Sareth, thought of her violet eyes and her rare smiles, and the way she held his hand when she was afraid. And he let the thought of her carry him through the agony days past, or perhaps weeks. Time lost meaning in the darkness of the cells. But Marcus did not break, and he did not confess. And eventually, the interrogators grew frustrated with this stubborn human who refused to give them what they wanted. Give him a choice, Emperor Kale ordered, visiting the cells in person to observe his prisoner. Let him leave Valorian space forever, or face execution for his crimes. I want to see him grovel, Want to see him abandon his precious princess to save his own worthless skin? The choice was delivered with ceremony. The guards, watching eagerly to see the human crumble Marcus, looked at the offer of freedom, looked at the chance to escape this nightmare and live out his days somewhere far from the Empire and its cruelties. "No," he said, his voice rough from screaming, but steady with conviction. "I will not leave her." The guards stared at him in disbelief. "You choose death?" One of them asked. "You choose execution over freedom for a woman who is not even your species?" "I choose loyalty," Marcus replied. "Something your kind seems to have forgotten." They beat him again for his insolence. But Marcus barely felt it through the warmth in his chest. He had made his choice. And it was the only choice he could have made far across the Empire. Sareth received word of Marcus's arrest and felt something cold and terrible settle into her heart. She had been naive, had believed that her position would protect him, had trusted that even Kale would not dare to violate the sacred bond of Valkeitha. She had been wrong, and her human was paying the price for her foolishness. But Sareth was not the frightened princess she had once been, and she had learned lessons from Marcus Cole that her brother could never understand. She began to build her rebellion in whispers and shadows, reaching out to those who chafed under Kale's tyranny. Noble houses that had lost members to the purges answered her call in secret. Military officers who remembered honor and duty joined her cause, and slowly, carefully, a network of resistance took shape. But the most important message she sent traveled to the human frontier colonies, to the scattered settlements where humanity had carved out a life on the edges of civilized space. She told them about Commander Marcus Cole, about the man who had bled for a princess and chosen death over abandoning her, about the loyalty and courage that their kind possessed in abundance. And humanity listened in his cell. Marcus endured another round of interrogation, another attempt to break his spirit and force his confession. "Just tell us what we want to hear," the interrogator said, almost pleading now. "Tell us that you manipulated her, that humans are incapable of true devotion, and this can all be over." Marcus thought of 17 days in the wasteland, thought of 5 years as her shadow, thought of the moment she pressed her forehead against his and admitted that she was afraid. "Humans love," he said quietly. "We love without reason and without limit and without counting the cost. And that is something you will never understand." The interrogator raised his hand to strike again. But before the blow could land, an explosion rocked the palace above them. The rebellion had begun, and humanity was coming for one of their own. Marcus smiled through bloody lips and closed his eyes. "Hold on, Sareth," he whispered to the darkness. "I am still here, and somewhere in the chaos above, a princess turned queen turned revolutionary led her forces against her own brother, and the galaxy would never be the same." The human frontier colonies had never involved themselves in Valorian politics before. For centuries, they had kept their heads down, working and trading and surviving on the edges of an empire that considered them barely worth noticing. But then the stories came, carried by smugglers and merchants and refugees fleeing. Kale's cruelty stories of a human commander who had bled for a princess and refused to abandon her even when freedom was offered. Stories of a man named Marcus Cole who sat in an imperial cell, enduring torture rather than betray the woman he loved, and humanity decided that enough was enough. The declaration of support for Princess Sareth came as a shock to the entire galaxy. A statement from the Human Colonial Council that made clear their intentions. "We stand with those who stand with us," the declaration read, "and we will not abandon our own to the cruelty of tyrants." Ships launched from a dozen human worlds, crewed by volunteers who knew they might never return, carrying weapons and supplies and the fierce determination that had always defined their species. General Varathkal, one of the Valorian commanders who had joined Sarath's rebellion, watched the human fleet arrive with confusion evident on his scaled face. "They are so fragile," he said to Sareth, gesturing at the human soldiers who were unloading from the transports. They possessed no natural armor, no enhanced senses, no regeneration. How can they possibly help us win this war? Sareth smiled, and there was something dangerous in her expression. You will see, she said. Trust me, General, you will see. The rescue mission to free Marcus was planned with precision. A strike team of rebels and human volunteers working together to breach the palace defense. Sasseroth wanted to lead the mission herself. But her advisors convinced her that the rebellion needed her alive more than it needed her heroism, so she waited. And she prayed to gods she had never believed in. And she hoped that Marcus was still alive. The strike team breached the detention level at dawn, fighting through guards and security systems with a ferocity that caught the defenders off guard. Sergeant Elena Vasquez of the Human Colonial Marines led the assault. A small woman with hard eyes and a voice like thunder. Cole, she shouted, kicking open cell doors one after another. Commander Cole, sound off. They found him in the deepest cell, chained to a wall. His body covered in wounds that would have killed a lesser man. He was gaunt and scarred and barely conscious. But when Elena cut through his chains, he managed to stand on his own feet. Took you long enough, he rasped. And something that might have been a laugh escaped his cracked lips. Yeah, well, we had to convince the whole galaxy that humans are worth something first, Elena replied, slinging his arm over her shoulder. Can you walk? I can do whatever I need to do, Marcus said, and despite everything, his voice was steady. They fought their way out of the palace, human soldiers holding the line while their wounded commander was evacuated. And the Valorian guards learned something that day that they would never forget. Humans did not break when one fell. Another took their place, dragging their wounded comrade to safety, even under heavy fire. When they were outnumbered, they fought harder, not less, as if the odds only made them more determined. And when logic said retreat, when any sensible species would have calculated the losses and withdrawn, the humans kept coming. General Varath Kal watched the battle from the command center, his confusion slowly transforming into something like awe. Why do they not break? He asked a human colonel beside him. They are taking heavy casualties. Their position is untenable. And yet they continue to fight. Colonel James Wright, a veteran of a dozen human conflicts, shrugged his shoulders. We have a saying, General, he replied. You do not have to win. You just have to not quit. That makes no sense, Varath Kal protested. Victory should be the goal, not mere survival. Maybe, Wright agreed. But survival has a way of becoming victory if you hold on long enough. The rescue team made it out with minimal losses. And when Sareth saw Marcus carried through the rebel base, she abandoned all pretense of royal dignity. She ran to him, pushing past advisors and guards and concerned officers. And when she reached him, she pulled him into an embrace that said everything words could not express. You came for me, he whispered against her hair. I will always come for you, she replied. Always. The Battle of Kethra's Prime would be remembered as the turning point of the rebellion. The moment when the tide shifted against Emperor Kale and his forces. It was a desperate fight. Outnumbered rebels against the full might of the Imperial fleet, and by all calculations, it should have been a massacre, but the human contingent anchored the defensive line, and they refused to yield. Valorian ships broke formation when losses mounted too high. Their crews, calculating survival odds and choosing retreat, human ships held their positions until they were burning. Their crews fighting until the last possible moment. Their sacrifice buying time for the rebel fleet to regroup and counterattack. Valorian general surrendered his forces after watching a human destroyer ram an Imperial cruiser rather than withdraw from the battle. What are these creatures? He asked, his voice shaking with something that might have been fear or might have been respect. What kind of species chooses death over retreat? Sareth, commanding the rebel fleet from her flagship, answered him with steel in her voice. They are human, she said. and they are fighting for one of their own. The battle turned, and then it was won. And Emperor Kale's forces scattered in defeat. Marcus watched the victory from the medical bay. Still too weak to fight, but strong enough to see the dream become reality. A human medic named Sarah was changing his bandages when the news of victory came through. And she smiled at him with tears in her eyes. "We did it, Commander," she said. "We actually did it," Marcus nodded. But his thoughts were elsewhere, reaching across the ship to where Sarah stood on the bridge. "Leading her people to freedom, we did," he agreed. "But the hardest part is still to come." Sarah looked at him with confusion. But Marcus did not explain. He knew that winning the war was only the beginning. That the real challenge would be building a peace that included humans and Valorians alike, but he also knew that Sarah would face that challenge. And that he would be beside her when she did, and for now, that was enough. Emperor Kale Valkyra fell on a battlefield far from the palace where he had seized power. Abandoned by his allies and surrounded by enemy, Sareth did not witness his death. But she felt it like a weight lifted from her shoulders. Like chains falling away after a lifetime of captivity, the war was over and she had won. And now came the task that frightened her more than any battle. She had to become empress. The coronation ceremony was held in the great hall of the imperial palace. The same hall where she had invoked the blood debt 5 years ago and bound a human mercenary to her house. The two noble families of the empire had gathered in their finest robes, their scales gleaming under the ceremonial lights, their eyes watching her with mixtures of respect and fear and calculation. Climbed the steps to the throne with her head held high, wearing the traditional vestments of her ancestors and carrying the weight of 40 star systems on her shoulders. The high priest placed the imperial crown upon her head, speaking the ancient words that had marked the ascension of Valorian rulers for 1,000 generations. "Rise, Sareth Valkyra," he intoned, "Empress of the Valorian Dominion, Protector of the Realm, Voice of the Stars." She rose, and the crowd knelt before her, and she felt the power of her position settle around her like a cloak. But the ceremony was not finished. And what came next would shock the galaxy to its core. "Before I accept the oaths of my subjects," Sareth announced, her voice carrying through the silent hall, "there is a matter I must address." She descended from the dais, her robes trailing behind her, and walked into the crowd of kneeling nobles. They parted before her like water, uncertain and afraid. And she moved through them with purpose until she reached a single figure standing near the back of the hall. Marcus Cole had tried to fade into the background, as he always did, his scarred face and simple clothing marking him as an outsider among the jeweled and perfumed aristocracy. But Sareth had found him, as she had always found him, and now the entire court watched as their new empress stood before a human. "Marcus Cole," she said, and her voice rang through the hall like a bell. He began to kneel, but she stopped him with a gesture. "No," she commanded. "You do not kneel to me. Not now and not ever." The court stirred with confusion and outrage. Whispers spreading like fire through dry grass. Sareth ignored them all and kept her eyes fixed on the man who had bled for her, suffered for her, chosen death over abandoning her. "You have bled for me as my guardian," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Fought for me as my soldier, stood beside me as my friend." She reached out and took his hand, his scarred human fingers intertwining with her scaled ones. "The blood debt was repaid 100 times over," she continued. "You owe me nothing, Marcus Cole. I release you from all obligations and bonds." The court fell silent, uncertain what this meant, uncertain what was happening. Marcus looked at her with confusion in his brown eyes. But he did not pull away. "Sareth," he said quietly, "what are you doing?" "I am making a choice," she replied, and now her voice softened so that only he could hear. "The only choice I have ever truly wanted to make." She turned to face the court, still holding his hand, and when she spoke again, Her voice was strong enough to reach every corner of the vast hall. "I am no longer a princess who needed protection," she declared. "I am a queen who has chosen her equal." The outrage exploded immediately. Noble houses shouting their objections, ancient traditions being invoked, predictions of doom and disaster filling the air, but Sarah stood unmoved. And Marcus stood beside her, and neither of them flinched. "He is human," Lord Varathanal shouted, his scales flushing dark with fury. "You cannot elevate a lesser species to stand beside the imperial throne." Sarah smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "This human crossed a wasteland for me while my Valorian guards fled or died," she said. "This human took poison meant for my heart and survived through sheer stubborn will. This human sat in a cell and endured torture rather than speak a single word against me." She looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of every noble who dared to hold her gaze. When the galaxy told him that humans were lesser, he proved them wrong with every scar he carries, she continued. "And I choose him not because he is bound to me, but because he earned his place at my side with blood and pain, and a loyalty that none of you can comprehend." She turned back to Marcus, and her voice was soft again. "I choose you," she said. "If you will have me," Marcus looked at her. This alien woman who had transformed his life, who had seen something in him that he had never seen in himself. He thought of 17 days in the wasteland, of 5 years as her shadow, of torture cells and battles, and the moment she pressed her forehead against his and told him she was afraid. He thought of all the reasons this was impossible, all the obstacles and prejudices and hatreds that stood between them, and then he stopped thinking and simply answered, "I have been yours since the day I decided to bleed for you," he said. "I will be yours until the day I stop." He took her hand properly then, not as a guardian or a protector, but as a partner. And the galaxy shifted on its axis. The noble houses would grumble and scheme. The traditionalists would never fully accept the human beside the throne. And the future would bring challenges that neither of them could predict. But in that moment, none of it mattered. A human stood beside a queen, and he had earned his place with every scar on his body and every choice he had made. Years later, a young Valorian noble would ask the Empress why she had chosen a human for her consort. Sareth would smile, a soft and private expression that few ever saw. And she would give an answer that would become legend throughout the galaxy. Because when everyone else calculated the odds, she would say, "He was already bleeding for me." She would look across the room to where Marcus stood, older now but still strong, still scarred, still watching over her with those soft brown eyes. "That is the human way," she would continue. "They love recklessly, fight hopelessly, and somehow, against all reason, they win." And the young noble would look at the human consort, at the scars he wore like medals and the quiet strength in his stance, and would begin to understand what the Empress meant, because Marcus Cole had not won through strength or cunning or superior abilities. He had won through something much simpler and much more powerful. He had won through devotion, through loyalty, through a stubborn refusal to give up on the woman he loved. And in the end, that had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had changed the galaxy.